And welcome to our first panel. Our first panel is going to be forecasting the future for the strategic security environment in 2050. So we will look out to 2050. Yesterday, I mentioned Cohen and Gooch, the failure to learn, failure to adapt, and failure to anticipate. And this panel, to me, is really about anticipating. And as Howard said, and as both General Perkins and General Milley have said, not getting it too wrong. I'm going to ask the panelists to talk about their unique approaches looking at the drivers of change. I'm going to introduce them in reverse order and of how we're going to proceed today. You heard Dr. Chalecki yesterday, and she's been a huge driver in the realm of climate change. Dr. Zenzen will be, is very knowledgeable expert in megacities, and Dr. Zalman in the world of futures and forecasting. Now, I believe that they're going to really help us think about what we are missing and how we can do a better job partnering with universities, with other institutions, industry, so that we are able to get this mostly right. Dr. Chalecki researches, the whole realm of things: transboundary environmental security and foreign policy topics, climate change and security, international environmental policy, intersection of science and international relations. And you heard her great presentation yesterday. She'll speak last. Dr. Zenzen, the Chief Operating Officer for ASURE. That's right. And, she is really knowledgeable, an expert, one of the leading experts in data, in megacities, in nonlinear thinking and complexity. And when I hear that, I'm reminded of Clausewitz and Alan Byerson's article on in his work on Clausewitz and nonlinearity and complexity. And then, of course, interdisciplinary approaches on collaboration. One of the things we're really focused on here, the interdisciplinary aspect. And then Dr. Zalman, Amy Zalman, is a global security futurist dedicated to leveraging the power of the narrative to accelerate transformational change. And her career-long focus has been on the impacts of global security and shifts in the global balance of power, defense and intelligence related issues, and on the critical roles of culture, communication, narrative, and myth in generating change and innovation. And just like we talked about yesterday, it's about understand, visualize, and describe. And so the narrative is critical to that. Now, I'm going to ask each of them to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then depending on what Kira allows us for time, we should have about 20 or 30 minutes for discussion. But my questions to the audience, and as you hear these presentations, I'd like you to keep in mind a couple and use these to ask questions of our panelists. Number one is, how can their ideas and what they present in this panel be folded into the Army's current processes for thinking about the future? I think General Perkins really discussed that yesterday. We got to turn ideas into action. So, and it's all of you that really need to think about that. And then, of course, what can academics, industry, and other strategic partners to the Army provide to help the Army with our strategic forecasting ability? So as you listen today, listen to their presentations, please think about that and use those to generate some questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Zalman.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. So I arrived on this panel after last week. Dr. Hutchinson came to me and asked what you're asking. What's missing? What are we missing? So to let you know, I didn't put this presentation together until I listened for a while, because I don't, how could I possibly know? And I would say after yesterday, and also after following this project and TRADOC's work in Foresight for a while now, there is nothing missing. The question is, what now can you add? And I have been watching the Olympics at night, so all I see is swimming and gymnastics. So I have fitness on my mind, and what it means for somebody to set an objective for the future, and what they have to do in between, which is not simply visualize a future, but be in action all the way up to that ever moving line of the future. So my remarks are about foresight itself and about institutionalizing foresight and how maybe to get into what you talked about yesterday, General Perkins, and this morning a bit, a more proactive position. That is, change doesn't simply come at an institution. That institution wants to replay out the only thing they really have, which is a particular image of the future. We don't have it. We have images and others have images. So how do we get ours, whatever the our is, into mobilized in a network? So I have a couple of things. One is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do and why I do it, only as it pertains to here. I don't know how to switch to the next. I don't have a next slide, please. So I started my own firm about 6 months ago dedicated to strategic foresight in the global security and human security, national security space, because I think that space is not full enough yet, especially in our national security community. You may have seen, and it's called the Strategic Narrative Institute, and I'm going to tell you why, this kind of chart before. I will also say very briefly that I put these together quickly, working with an illustrator. They should look better in the future, but I'm not a graphic designer. I just wanted to communicate clearly, clearly what these graphics can say. So this is something typical. These are, you will recognize these drivers of change. They are standard in your toolkit and in the toolkits of futurists. The list that you just gave, General Milley, I added culture, communications, and media because I think they are such critical drivers these days. If someone were to ask me what is in my top list of what to pay attention to coming 2050, it would be shifts in power, not simply national power, but the ways in which private firms, corporations, what are now being called super empowered individuals. There are good ones, there are bad ones, ones we like, ones we don't like. People, and the ways people, groups, subnational, transnational actors, all are playing in the governance space. And we are watching disruption after disruption in the last month. Brexit, the Republican National Committee, and Erdogan have all watched themselves governance change. But this isn't really, but the first chart isn't what I think really happens in change. We don't have change coming at us, changed conditions, and then we change in response. There is always a mediating narrative. We interpret what's coming at us. We have a worldview that shapes it. And that's what we carry around in our minds, and that's what drives our behavior, and it's what drives other behavior. And I think that little circle is so important because it's the place where we act. And the more that we know, and I say we very generically right now, the more that TRADOC knows, the more the Army knows, the more the national security community knows how to work in that space, the more nuanced a lever it has for understanding and maneuvering its own narratives and for manipulating for the good the narratives of its wider network. So what happens, next slide please, when you want to change, when you want to affect the future that will unfold? You have a preferred future. Someone used the term, interestingly, preferred future yesterday in one of the presentations. They meant by that what is in national security documents. The way that futurists have often used this term comes from Alvin Toffler, recently died, very famous. He said to us, we need in future shock. I suggest, he said, three things that we need in order to make a better democracy is what he was talking about. We need an art of forecasting. We need to be able to imagine. Max Brooks is going to talk to you later about imagining, right? Real fiction. I think so. But so you're the representative right now of imagining. But we all need to do it. We need a science of foresight. That's what everyone has been talking about. We need forecasts that tell us what historical patterns seem to be saying until now and where they diverge, bifurcate, what are signals of those on the horizon. And we need preferable futures. those that we negotiate in democratic contexts out of what we imagine we like and what trends tell us are our constraints and real possibilities. So you will have a preferred future. When you can manipulate, that word is not the best, it has a negative connotation, but when you can play with the levers of narrative, part of your job begins to be able to spread your view of the future among your stakeholders, adversaries, lawmakers, the national security community at large, within your organization, among the general public, and allies in your worldview. So we'll leave it at that, but that is my operating image all of the time of this really very dynamic, not static picture, because it also needs to be in motion all of the time, because trends change and events change. So what are 5 ways to sort of start doing this in TRADOC potentially and in the Army at large? And I am not saying anything that's new. In fact, I am reflecting back some of the things that came up yesterday and are certainly there previously. So number 1 is achieve supreme clarity about the task at hand. What I mean by this, and this also came up yesterday, I'll put it this way, is distinguishing between intelligence work and foresight. They are not the same. So someone said yesterday it's about expanding the numbers of possibilities, vice narrowing them to certainty, the work of intelligence. I will put it a slightly different way. The governing metaphor, as far as I can tell from all of the op-eds I've ever read, for intelligence is connecting dots. Intelligence people are people who put together a puzzle that is presumed to exist in total somewhere. Some pieces are being hidden, some are not, right? They're obscured from view in some way, they're not connected. But if we could connect them, we'd have an intelligence picture. Future, no dots. No dots. There is nothing there. And I say it like that because we have images of the future in our minds, we think there is, but there aren't. What we have are history up to this moment of what the environment is doing, of the ways in which cities are changing, or populations are moving, and so forth. So what you can do, number 1, just from a worldview perspective, is keep that in mind all the time. And I think it's worth being vigilant about in this context, because there's always an urge, I think institutionally, if I may say, for certainty. That's difficult. It's difficult for anyone. It's difficult in institutions. It may be difficult in the Army. So be sophisticated about how to work with trends. Get more sophisticated about how to think about established trends, emerging signals, those that are out on the horizon, when they bifurcate, and so forth. Number 2, be vigilant also about the categories that you are using, because they are the ultimate drivers of what you do and what others do. The only way we can organize knowledge is in categories. We don't just have all these kinds of crazy sort of facts floating around. We organize them. This is an international system. This is a shoebox for understanding what the Army does. This is a shoebox for understanding what a refugee is. Vis-a-vis, right? So we have categories, and they get reified. They get reified in law, they get reified in norms and behavior. Those categories drive everything. The reason that we're all here in this room together is because the categories of the industrial age are being so ripped apart that everybody is starting to notice the categories of the way to organize an institution, hierarchies, the categories of production, right? The ways, the shoeboxes of the international system. They're being blown apart by reality, by changing conditions. One of the questions that I had yesterday, and this is a bit challenging, I probably can say it only as an outsider, is about the category of the Army itself. Strategic documents tell me that it must prepare for disaster relief, for stability operations, for a wide variety of activities, and it does. Much of the discourse, much of the time, is really about war and battling adversaries only. So I asked someone, is there a pie chart somewhere about the trend of Army work itself? In the last 10 years, in the last 15 years, how much of 100% of Army labor hours have been dedicated to these different activities? And that is a very challenging category itself because it speaks to the identity of the institution, but in it may lie opportunity. If the character of war changes significantly, there may be opportunities in shifting activities that maintain its, not only maintain, but promote its relevance all the more.
Did you get an answer for that question?
Well, somebody said to me that, no, that doesn't, but it was proposed to me that actually the COCOMs have, right, each have that. And so if you spliced and diced a little bit differently, you could get it.
Okay.
Number 3, invest in foresight as a worldview and a set of activities. So this is training. I do not mean everyone has to shift from their current job and become a futurist, but I do actually think it is very much worth going down to quite low levels and doing some basic training on the worldview of foresight and trends and signals itself. Because in a well-networked organization, everyone, and there are edges all over of your network, and we are not it, your institution is it, is a sensor of change in institutional culture and of change out in theater. Number 4, refine your plans for preferred futures. What did I say? Continually refine your preferred future vision. I have already sort of said what I wanted to say on this before, and it was about Toffler. It was about negotiating all of the time, internally, what kind of future you want to see, because this is part of actually having it unfold. And it is as critical at a certain point as collecting trends and putting together a vision of what it may be, what it will be, probably without intervention. So start adding back your interventions and seeing how you might plan those out. And number 5, next slide, please. Institutionalize. Institutionalize the activity of foresight, by which I mean, if the conclusions and the insights that are reached in forums like these don't go back into the decision-making process all the time, then they float away, then they aren't anything. Next slide, please. And I gave this its own slide, and I actually turned it into a swimmer because this is the Michael Phelps, super god activity. So in my this is a very surface view, but what are the elements of institutionalizing strategic forecasting? Collecting trends, collecting data all the time, being sophisticated about that. You do that. Synthesizing, collecting pictures, both formal and informal, in strategic documents and elsewhere. You do that. Developing a narrative, developing an ongoing process of creating a story of what you want and where you need to go to tell it and to try to instantiate it. Where are inputs, and of course this happens, and I don't have insight into the specific decision-making process, but there are discrete ways, of course, of deciding that what has happened in the gathering and synthesizing point goes into certain sets of decisions. This is not just sort of purchasing for 2050. It's training decisions, possibly doctrinal decisions. And the measurement that I'm talking about afterward, as part of a feedback loop, right back into trends, is not did you get the picture of the future right? Did you get something right the way intelligence asks? Did we get it right? Did we miss it? Did we get it? Because we never get to it. It is how much, to what degree did what you are doing in these first parts make it into decision making, make it into activity, and how much did that matter? Did you get somewhere? And there are other ways of measuring what I would call foresight performance. Are you doing the activity? And to what degree do senior leaders who need to be apprised of these, do they say that it helped them? So there are ways, too, of keeping up with whether this activity is actually sustaining a learning organization or not. Finally, my what is missing, last slide, just if I have a say in it. Yesterday, I heard a lot of things, but I heard very little about people. And I do not mean at the very level of our cognitive, sort of, right, there's all kinds of cultural study, and I do not mean, what I mean is in the aggregate. There were contexts, there were places, there were the occasional sort of angry environmentalists of the future who get together, and right, there were sort of options. But people have always been all there is, as you know very well. Today, because of the ways that we can relate, we do relate, our increasing power in the aggregate, we are critically important. And so what we are and what we do, globally, regionally, institutionally, I think is an important piece of the forecasting whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zalman. Dr. Zenzen?
Call me Fran.
Fran.
All right, so thank you for inviting me. If you could pull the chart up. Everyone should say this is a terrible chart, and it is. So I'm only going to cover the first 3 bullets, and then if you get bored with my dialogue, you can read the rest. Couple of things. I'm reading Army Magazine this month, and a Civil Affairs article is in there, and it says, if the conflicts of the 21st century have made anything more apparent, it's America's pathological problem with ending or preventing wars rather than fighting them. And he's retired. First, I thought it was a real colonel, and I was like, oh my goodness gracious, but it was for a retired colonel. But you know, so everybody breathe. I should give you a little bit of background. Over 30 years in defense for me. I am an academic as well. I teach. It's all about the math for me. I'm a stochastic modeler and a doubly underneath. So it's all about the math. It's all about patterns. For the folks in here who know me, someone provoked me before this session to be provocative. So everyone in the G2 office should be sweating. That is a very nervous thing. Most of my time in Intel, soldier systems, net warrior, those kind of things. So when I read this, I thought it's something we've been doing in mega cities. It is that inability to let go of what you know, including for me. Besides being in defense, being an academic, I'm a mom as well. I got a 26-year-old and a 19-year-old. And if I could predict human behavior, the 19-year-old would be out of the house, right? But I'm struggling with this. Anyone have ideas? Come up later, all right? I tried the military. He's fighting me on this. I think we like to hold on to what we know. And if we grew up, I remember General ASURE would talk about measurement and intelligence for tanks, Russian tanks, because it's what she learned when she was a lieutenant and a captain in the Army. And as things continued to change, that was always stuck in the back of her head, that was what she had learned. So I'll point out a couple things to you. It's, by the way, my 5-year update's in process, so let's not turn me in. I just want to, only got a couple more months. Let's just talk about some things. 2025 is 9 years away. I periodically help folks with the LIRA process, looking at what the future would be. I always tell them if I could predict the future, the Jets would win the Super Bowl and several other things would happen that are very improbable. So, so it's 9 years away. It's the colonels of that year are probably your captains now. How are you training them? How are they engaging in activities? Are you including them? You know, I've read a number. I try to stay on top of books. I'm always N-1 behind Kira. But, you know, Counterinsurgency is my latest book from David Kirkcullen. And he's like, hey, they kind of learned on their own the first time. You know, doctrine was here and they were here. And they're like, that's not working. I better figure out how to stay alive, how to do that. So I like to look at how are we training our captains now. Are we still bludgeoning them with PowerPoint slides that look like this very bad one right here? Or are we doing that interactive? Are they making their own vignettes? And I'm going to say that I've worked with every one of the 5 I's. I've worked with every branch of the military and probably half the IC. It is not a unique problem to the Army, what I'm talking about. We like to, I think sometimes it's an Army problem. It's not. It is a systemic problem across almost society right now, how people think and how we train people. We're struggling with it in academics. You know, I'm still using PowerPoints and my students are going on Wikipedia going, you're wrong. I go, really? Let me see that. Wikipedia is not a god, right? 2050s, 34 years from now, that colonel maybe hasn't been born yet. Maybe they have, but maybe they haven't. And you know, how we approach, how we train people, how we approach, how we share our information, how we approach, how we deal with different biases and issues in our own education and our own becomes very critical. But I always like to think that when I'm dealing, I've spent some time with the ICO folks, the Intelligence Center of Excellence folks, and I was like, hey, that person hasn't been born yet. You have an open slate to predict the future, but I would maintain that you go where you're looking. Or as my mom used to say, either go where you're looking or look where you're going, right? One or the other. If you project that there's going to be hover bicycles or there's going to be, as Ernie's doing, you are going to head in that direction. So I think it's important. I'll tell you, as an educator, there's some facts that don't necessarily match the chart here. My students, when I'm teaching them, will be connected just like you can in here on wireless. If I ask them a question, they will spend 20 minutes on Google to do something they could have learned in 5 minutes. Google, it's out there somewhere. I have to find what somebody did before. And if you look at the takeaway I have there, that strategic thinking is critical, that's what we're missing. We would rather not think, yours include, I love Google, man. I don't know who, Google, I was telling, you know, I can look up anything, I can get right there. Whether it's right or not, I never check. I just go off and I do that. And so that, what I'll call mind laziness, needs to, we need to find a way to come up and over that, and we need to set the example for that. And I struggle with it myself because it's just so darn easy. You know, oh, somebody must have solved this before. I'm making up a test. Somebody must have made a problem already. I'll just put it on the student's test. Just as guilty. I point out to you that when I'm teaching in my class, I teach probability and statistics. How many people still have their probability and statistics book? Oh, see me after. A lot of people threaten to burn it or beat me with it. So, so I'm good with that. So what I'll tell you is about a half of my class is foreign. And I know Mr. Peter Singer is going to be talking later, but we assume that we are going to have a advantage. And we may just be neutral. You may be fighting next to the person that went to school with you, whether it's at Princeton, whether it was ASU, whether it was at you know, Rutgers, wherever you went. And so it's important to remember that we are training the world, and our students are also going other places and being trained there. So I just want to point out that there's not a market on we just train our own and, you know, they get lesser education. We're right out there. And education is one of the few places where ITAR doesn't apply. So all of us who have grown up in ITAR, you know, FMS sales, you know, I'm sorry about the acronyms later for the folks, but if you grew up in that environment, education's an open market. And you can find out just about anything you need to know on Google. Going back to General Perkins' comment about innovate versus innovation, I love that. I hadn't heard you say that before, anyone say that before. That is amazing. And I will remind you that academic institutions don't work for free. So at least once a month, somebody comes to me and says, hey, you got some professors sitting around here who want a hard problem? No, they get paid too. And so they might be looking for a hard problem. And the trick in academia becomes, does your hard problem interest them? Because if it doesn't, they won't do it. You know, they just won't. And people give academics a hard time, but you hit the main vein and you hit something they like, you'll be there. But nobody is sitting around waiting to do stuff for free. I don't know who that is, and it's probably not in a open market. So just be aware that when you come with your problems, when you come with the big challenge, you want to do that. You have a number of education touch points in academic environments, ROTC, your reserves back on GI through the university. I've had both of them in my classes, both of them. And I like them because I can use my acronyms and they're like, they laugh and everyone else like, what are you talking about? So it is important to tap into these touch points. Your ROTC students, your West Point cadets are learning in a different way than you're training them when they come into the Army, into the Navy, into the Marine Corps. I see you, John. So they learn differently. If you relearn them to learn another way, they'll do it, but may not be to your advantage. I'm going to say process. So I have a number of weirdy credentials in my background, ISO and Software Engineering Institute, a number of those. No process will compensate for a lack of talent. All right? No process. I say that as a statistician and then tell you to answer false to that question. No process will compensate for a lack of talent. You cannot train people to be what they're not. Pete Palmer talking about cognitive shoe size. The people in here, if you've had a child where you're like, if you would just put your mind to it, you'll learn this. And they're like, no, I won't, and I'll show you besides. But you know, I'm not going to do that. And this is a universal truth from my perspective. If I don't want to do something, if I'm not capable, I was watching synchronized diving last night. I'm like, that would be cool. I'm not capable. And nobody make any comments, all right? I'm too old or whatever else. What I'm going to leave you, two last thoughts. One is predicting from a mathematician point of view is saying something will happen. Forecasting is saying when it will happen, okay? Good luck with either of those things. We spend an inordinate amount of time trying to predict or forecast the future. I maintain if you can help people think and make it safe for them, they will, regardless, as you said, General Perkins, regardless of the scenario that hits them, they will adapt. They won't say, well, this isn't what I learned, or none of the above, all of the above. That is not life. And so I think it's very important about critical thinking. And what I'll leave you with is, I don't think it's about thinking out of the box. I think it's about thinking without a box at all. I get accused of being an out-of-the-box thinker. All right, that sounds good. I don't want to be in a box. I can't believe Kira made me sit in this chair for a whole session. So I'm just like, forget the box. Think as a big pattern, and think about how that will look. And so my third point up there is, we need to train soldiers in the environment they're going to be in. If that's an urban environment, it won't be the anomaly. It'll be the case that everyone lives in an urban environment. If it is, you have so much data. For those of us who are older than 45, 50 years old in here, just getting data was a big deal. Now we have too much, and picking out the right data and doing that. So those are my thoughts for you. I'm looking forward to your questions and any advice on the 19-year-old.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Chalecki.
Thank you. That's a good point about education. I also have had ROTC students and returned veterans in my class, and it's fascinating because they bring a whole new perspective, which I quite enjoy. I don't have any slides. I showed you all the slides yesterday with the scary temperatures and the refugees and the lootable commodities and so on.
Great.
Thank you. So I'm not going to give you any more slides. I'm not even going to give you any recommendations. In fact, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions because I think this is something that I would like to hear you all tell me. One of the objectives we were given when we were constituted for this panel was make recommendations on the challenges that must be overcome to bring new approaches to forecasting into the Army. And the only question I would ask is, you have all the data, as Dr. Zenzen pointed out, you have all the data at your disposal. You have big data. Where's the big understanding? Where is what you do with the data such that you see the pattern and where it fits in? Keep an eye on those environmental indicators. You have all the data. You have thousands of scientists all over the world who are working to provide this data for you. Much of it is free. The IPCC then takes the data and compiles it into a ridiculously large report. It's the size of 4 Manhattan phone books. It's goofy. I can't even carry it. I'm tired of taking it to class. Get one of the guys to help me. And it is all available for free. What are you going to do with the data? They will provide you with the data. You need to provide the understanding. Now, the Army has capabilities. It's powerful, smart, and fast. Although, as we heard yesterday, constrained by budget. That's fine. There's no institution that isn't constrained by budget. What you are missing is the connective link to integrate the data. Who translates the IPCC for the Army? How do these two constituencies speak to one another and learn from one another? I heard a lot of talk about innovation, innovative ideas and innovation. But innovation is only essential if it yields a net benefit that is usable that would not have been yielded using another method. Otherwise, why bother? So you are dealing with the realm of counterfactuals. That's what you need the big understanding for. I heard a lot of talk about deterrence. Deterrence is essential. What is being deterred? The Army is fast. The Army is powerful. As General Milley just pointed out, we have troops and tanks and helicopters, but they will not protect you from a drought. And these large, capable ground forces that command respect will not command respect from a Zika-carrying mosquito. I heard a lot of talk about targeting. Who is asking the question, why is that the target? One of our speakers yesterday talked about putting, I want to get this phrase exactly right, placing a kinetic effect on a target, aka killing somebody. Wow, I never heard it put quite like that before. Putting a kinetic effect on a target. But why is that the target? Who is backing up and asking themselves that question? We can't answer these questions for you. We in academia, we in think tanks, we in companies, all we can help you do is formulate the questions and get you the data you need in a form you can use it so you can answer the questions yourselves. What can we do to help you? That was one of the other objectives we were given. Keep asking us to help you. We would like to help you. We would like to know, most academics, that our knowledge is going for something that's actually going to be useful in the real world. Not all academics. Many academics would like to see their knowledge useful in the real world. And those of us who've studied security across multiple realms and multiple domains, military or not, have got something valuable to offer you. And we would like the chance to offer it to you. This is a perfect example, this Mad Scientist Conference. So I will end there and open up the panel to questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Chalecki, and all three panelists. So now, let's think about our preferred future. Let's not have any mind laziness, and let's look at the big data to gain big understanding. Google. All right? Yeah, Google is your friend. So the floor is open to questions. Right here.
This is probably for the statistician on the panel. It seems to me that we're looking for a new way of thinking about these questions, and yet we're using thinking from the machine age. We're using averages, we're using trends. But when I look at the data, what appears more important is the variability. And that seems to be what's significant for the information age, not the machine age.
That is a super point. And it always worries me when somebody says the average is this or the mean is that, or they use median in a conversation. We had a session last week as part of the Army's megacities effort to talk about human socio and predicting human behavior last week. And it was all about variability. And how do you make decisions on, for those in here, roll with me, flat distributions, it goes anywhere from, your terrorist all the way down to your fully conforming whatever person and everything in between. So I think there's been some trends in mathematics looking at complex systems, moving away from regression, standard modeling techniques, and more complex, but it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while. I think the general populace is, the mathematical community is struggling with it as well.
So the last speaker asked several questions. How can we help you continue to have us involved? And a massive amount of data. We have individuals inside our organizations that can take data and routinely generate pretty much two-dimensional information. What we really are looking for is knowledge management of the data. And somehow, if academia could begin instructing the students at that young age the transformation of information into knowledge management, that will carry forward, I think, and pay huge dividends. But right now, the amount of data is overwhelming, And what I think senior leaders are struggling for the most is the knowledge management of the data and the information. So, you know, stay involved, but what we need is the knowledge management piece to help us focus on what you think is important out of not only the data, but the information that the data is generating.
Great.
Great point. Over here.
Oh, am I?
Oh,
Oh, hey. So first off, thank you very much. The whole idea behind Mad Scientists is to hear, if you will, opinions that we wouldn't ordinarily hear. So getting a diverse set of opinions and some feedback on your perspectives is really helpful. So, and Mad Scientists is to get to Dr. Chalecki's point about feedback. So Mad Scientists is this ongoing dialogue with industry, academia, and practitioners, much like modern universities, right? With academia teamed with industry and with practitioners. So other than writing out a check, because I am woefully short on that account, what kind of feedback is useful to you in your areas? What kind of feedback, what would that look like? What kind of feedback would you want from us?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever gotten feedback. Wow. That would be nice to know if what I was talking about here actually helped change somebody's mind or gave them a new piece of information to think about or a new question to ask themselves or a new data source to go to. I would love to know that. We provide feedback. We, the participants, I'm sure will have an opportunity to provide feedback about this experience, but I would love to know if anybody would have feedback to me about what they heard me say and if they have further questions and such. That would be great.
So to your point, yesterday your discussion and the very graphic descriptions of where climate change is going and how that'll, and the kinds of strategic impacts. Can you repeat that for the camera? Okay. So to your point, your discussion yesterday about climate change and strategic impacts is going to cause us, in terms of immediate feedback, is going to cause us to go back and review with the Army our thinking and our strategies in relation to climate change, because it was a very effective, really wake-up call in terms of where that is going. So how would you want us to keep you apprised as we move forward?
Well, that was feedback right there. Thank you. I'm glad to know that that sunk in. I would just like to know if there's doctrine changes that come out of it, if there's training changes, if there's any documents that come out of it that are then useful to soldiers in the field or to the decision makers. I would love to know that. And if you have any further questions, I'd like to make this an iterative process then. Come back to me with questions and I will try to give you information or whatever I can to help you.
okay, in the back over here.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this seems like a good forum to say this. I have a graduate class for strategic foresight at Georgetown University this fall. I'm looking for pro bono activity that they can do, either 1 or 2 activities. It's very hard. It's challenging to penetrate and do anything that, I take the word pro bono off, call it internship, on behalf of the government. I want them also to do something for industry, but if there is kind of a problem set that lends itself to them working on their using foresight methods, I would like to hear about it. They're free.
If I might,
They're free.
you have the process in place. The third offsets there. There's been a number of initiatives in my career where you have those processes in place. It's the right people. And people have to be committed because it is not a short-term solution. If I'm inventing something in a classroom today, if I'm doing, let's pick automated learning. It's huge right now, automated learning. It's not ready for prime time, but it might be ready for ARL. Naval Research Lab, some of the other folks, actually FiveYear here, some of ONR, some of the different folks. So I think you have some of those processes in place. Are they your thought leaders? Only you can answer. Some of those 9 organizations are roughly staffed.
To some of the speakers' comments on people and culture, there's 2 fundamental areas that I'd like your input on in terms of, one is, how do you culturally change the reward system so you get a government which has been living off of how you hang on to things as the reward and the benefit to actually give up things? And 2, how do you also get that same organizational construct and culture to then learn how to quickly reallocate individuals to higher priority topics so they don't have the Charlton Heston effect?
Who wants to jump on that hand grenade?
That's culture's not for me, that's for you ladies.
Yeah.
Sure. I think you're talking about incentives. And to points made yesterday, in complex systems and sort of a bureaucracy of bureaucracies, if we're talking about our space as opposed to somebody else's, that happens through a number of channels, right? There are sort of bottom-up ones, small departmental changes, all the things that you know about. I would add that my point about people is seeding public space, whatever public space is for you, with a particular vision is this is PR, is one way to start getting things done organically. The best possible thing is to have the change you want authored by somebody else and said back to you as if it were their idea. So I think that that is an important supplement to the existing sort of channels. I don't have a magic, this is how you culturally change. And anybody who says they do is because this system is too complex. Getting people to think on higher order, I don't know exactly what the context of your question is exactly, but holding people to higher standards and challenging them, I'm sure, everybody on this panel is an academic and my colleagues are full-time. It has always been my experience that people really want intellectual challenges. They get really excited. The challenge then is, if you're not in school with homework, is discipline and being held to that, to account for your excitement and maintain it. I think people like thinking big, and everybody wants to think they're a big picture thinker, so.
Everybody's above average.
It is like Wobegon.
Everybody's above average. Everybody above average.
And I'd just like to.
Doesn't mean everyone's brilliant.
I know that everybody, if you ask them, they're above
I'd
average.
just like to add to that question there. I think what Dr. Zenzen said about no process will compensate for a lack of talent. We are often slave to the process, and we got to find the right balance because we need the processes. You can't function without them, but we've got to be able to recognize the talent and let the talent function, within the process when necessary, but also outside of the process when necessary. And that's the real art of leadership and management, I think. And I think we become slave to the processes, and we've got to be willing to change those processes as necessary.
So to follow up on that point, again, thanks for you all coming here, both yesterday and today. So it is very interesting that when you talk about foresight, talk about foresight stereo, is compared to sort of predicting and forecasting. So it's interesting. We have apparently students getting a PhD in strategic foresight. I believe I barely have a GED and hindsight. Getting back to the point you made about reams of data and where's the connective tissue process, analytics moving from here to here. In some ways, I think we almost have too much of a process of connective tissue, to your point, that drives us to our desire, I think both from a military point of view and from a policy point of view, to get to a level of a sort of false precision that gives us a false sense of this is what it is, therefore it's this course of action, we're going to do that, et cetera. And that's a problem. Right. And then like a policy, you can find enough data or something to kind of reverse engineer that. You get, it's kind of like ask 4 lawyers for a legal opinion, you get 5 ideas. It'll be sort of the same thing with analytics. So this critical thinking, I think, is key. Kind of like you said, things are going to happen that you have never templated, et cetera, like that. But in my experience, not only in combat but in life, and so good leaders and good organizations can deal with that. So I get asked this question a lot. We have our leader development strategy in the Army. We have attributes and competencies, and we have critical thinking. So the question I always get, and it's a great question. So, General, how are you teaching critical thinking? How do you work it into your training exercise? So then that means not only that you teach it, but that somehow you measure it. Like when you walk into a room to say, oh, they're obviously teaching critical thinking. This must be a critical thinking class. Or if I go to training exercise, oh, this must be the critical thinking sticks lanes, because that's like, how do you recognize, oh, this is the critical thinking. That was the analytical sticks lanes. This is the critical thinking sticks lanes. what are those attributes that jump out like, okay, yeah, these guys got it, they're critical thinkers?
I don't think assigning an MOS will help. I always have statistics, but like they say 20% of the population is abstract thinkers. 70% is concrete, and then there's 10% that have to have concrete being, you need all the information before you can make a decision. Abstract thinkers, you don't need it all, you'll go with your best gut. And then there's that 10% at the bottom, and I could be wrong on these, someone will correct me, is you got to have not only all the right information, but it's got to be in the right order. These people will never be trained to be strategic thinker, big thinkers. And so I think I disliked this as a student, but I enjoy it as a professor. I put a problem on the test they've never seen before. Inevitably, there's half a meltdown. You can't test me on that. You never showed it to me. Oh my God, this is going to be a catastrophe. I found it when I would deploy systems with the military as well. If you said, hey, use this tool, I'm a GeoInt SIGINT type person, but use Esri, they're all over it because you trained them how to use Esri. If you say, hey, go find out what this MTI thing is doing, moving target indicator, MTI is doing, they struggle. Because they didn't learn how to solve a problem, they learned how to use a tool. So and this is not news to anybody in here, training people on tools, in academia as well, statistical tools, any tool, will inevitably stop them from thinking and force them to do something that you really wish they didn't. Because they'll just take the answer out of the tool and go with it. So I say stop training on tools. I'm not widely popular, but I just think, because it's so easy.
Or you have a threshold level of understanding of pliers, screwdrivers, hammers, and you have like a toolbox, but
Correct.
you really do focus on applying a basic understanding of tools to really defining problems. Number one, I find is a big problem, and then solving them.
Big problem, not do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good, thanks.
Let me ask a quick question on,
So you should let the gentleman-
some folks have argued that it's a fool's errand to try to figure out the future. Anything, say, beyond 4 or 5 years, because the data is not refined enough. There's other people that I've read that says, well, you've probably got enough information to figure out very, very broad trends and outcomes that is probably going to be worthwhile for up to 100 years. And then there's a third group who say, well, you can get the 100 years about right, you can get the 5 years about right, but everything in between you're going to get wrong. What are your thoughts on, and there's a whole wide variety of books out there on forecasting and so on. What is your thoughts on the value of forecasting? Because I am we have to put money on the table to do things that aren't going to be in the real world for 10, 15, 20 years. Whether it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, laying the keel of an aircraft carrier, figuring out the F-35 or, the new vehicles or whatever. So can you talk to me a little bit about the value and validity of forecasting and how much energy is the candle worth the flame here? How much energy, or is it a fool's errand to put massive amounts of energy? I happen to believe in it. I think it's worthwhile. But I may be wrong. So any comments on that?
I would make a technical distinction between forecasting and activity of understanding the threshold for a particular event that is highly mathematical, and strategic foresight, this more exploratory activity of trying to understand what could happen and what we would like to happen in the future. So forecasting to me is an element of the wider activity of foresight, just to be kind of lexically clear myself. I think this is a very valuable exercise. The very quick point that I made about being more sophisticated about trends is that all of what you said is true. There are some very stable indicators, stable trends, like demography, like the environment if we do not intervene in it, like some cultural trends. There are others that are much less stable and we don't even know if they are trends. We know that there are signals, and we know that they're variable. They are not events, but we see on the horizon the potential for living much longer, healthier lives. The importance of the activity comes in examining the potential sort of mutual impact of different trends. What happens when environmental issue, these are the kinds you think about in security, they turn into challenges and threats. What happens when resource deprivation meets a particular kinds of instability, meets social media? What happens when genomics, when our capacity to sort of manipulate humans genetically meets certain kinds of cultural desires or consumer desires? What kinds of children do we create, and what do we let ethically get by? So I think there is great worth in keeping an eye on the far future, because I don't want it to be a truism, but it is possible to take some proactive steps to mitigate and create opportunities out of keeping a keen eye, not on what will happen exactly, but what are the likely sort of vectors of activity in the future.
That's a really good way to put it, because I would challenge a general to define what you mean by figure out. You want us to figure out the future 5, 10 years out, 25 years out to 2100. What do you mean by figure out? We can't pinpoint it. No one can. And as Dr. Zalman mentioned, anybody that tries to tell you that is not giving you the truth.
Because you're not going to get a right answer.
Right.
You don't have to pinpoint it. But it has to be clear enough where we can take American taxpayer money in the billions of dollars and lay it on the table. And essentially, what we're doing is betting on A over B or C over D for something to be in the future. If we get it wrong, you might lose your freedom. I mean, so these are big bets on how to man, train, equip, structure the military forces of the United States against potential adversaries of threats, everything from Zika to nation states and everything in between. And then we have to do probability analysis on what's more likely, what's more dangerous, what's the consequence of the outcome, and so on and so forth, and put some big money on it. There are many people out there who say you're wasting your time. There's a lot of academics who say that when you get beyond about 5 to 6, 7 years, you're fundamentally wasting your time. That there's very few things, because there are so many variables and they interact in so many unpredictable ways, that any sort of trends are literally not knowable, and you're kind of wasting a lot of energy to do it.
Then it would seem that your maximum strategy at that point, given that you have minimum knowledge about the future but you want maximum flexibility, is going to have to try to maintain a cross-discipline knowledge base and the ability to move in any domain you need to when you need to do it. That's a very general strategy.
If those critics are true, then I would advocate for a strategy of organizations that are very adaptable to the unknown.
Precisely.
Sort of thing. On the flip side, so my question was, do you think the future is knowable? It's not knowable in a philosophical sense, but is it knowable in a practical sense, more or less? It's not. You're not going to get precision, and I know that. You're not going to be able to tell me the date and time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. You're not going to get that, probably. You might get it the day before and a signal intercept, but that's about it. But you probably, and this is hindsight, you probably could have, and there probably were, many people who said conflict with Japan is coming.
So they would have had multiple indicators telling them the conflict with Japan was. So we have multiple indicators of various kinds of trends, and as Dr. Zalman pointed out, to be able to see where the greatest danger comes from the intersection of these trends, that's where you put your money. I wouldn't put your billions and billions of dollars on any one square. You're going to have to spread it around and be ready to shift resources at a moment's notice if you need to.
I think it's a serenity prayer issue as well. I mean, you've got to choose wisely. And there are some things you may not be able to change. And I promised Kira, I'd say, 2050, you may have a colony on the moon. What's the Army thinking about that? Nothing. because you worry about it when they put the colony on the moon and how to protect it, right? I think there's some things.
Actually, outer
But
space
the moon
treaty,
is
we can't
ground.
put a colony on the
The
moon.
moon is ground.
It's a cool idea,
It
though.
is. It's so, I like to be
wanna
out there.
go.
I like to be colony on the moon or Mars, right? You know, I think it is worth it in the analysis with the right people. I can't say, I mean, as you look to the future, playing some of those things against one another, but I think our inclination nowadays is to say that's really hard. I know working the large city thing, they go, that's really hard. Well, what does that mean? We stop and we'll wait for it to happen and do it, but
It is really hard.
it is really hard.
I know it won't yield precision.
Right.
I think that the process of thinking about it, though, yields better judgments on, a probability of judgment.
It is everything.
On where you're going to put your assets, your resources.
The ability to
And
think
you
is
also
everything.
since we are the United States, and we're relative to other countries in the system for national security, where we put bets is probably going to help shape the outcome of that.
That's right. That's right. And prevent it, or prevent something like you were saying. Take evasive action. There's very little to be said in predicting something if it was catastrophic. The art would have been in saying, here it comes, let me get out of the way. You know, I have this argument with DARPA.
Sure, one thing that is knowable, I believe, is that whatever decision that you make in our transparent society, our adversaries are going to be trying to counter that from the time you make your decision. And so as we go forward, whatever systems you develop, you decide on, you know, our adversaries are going to try to counter those starting now, at this point. And so I think we have to take that into account and, you know, realize that, you know, obviously the enemy has a vote. But they're always going to be trying to counter us. You know, unless we could do something in complete secrecy, which I think is, you know, near impossible these days, they're going to be working to counter whatever you decide to do.
I don't want to push imagination too far, but I mean, this is a moment to ask, so what else is there besides counter and, right, create, counter?
How can we be proactive?
Interrogate that.
Okay, it's the puppet master? Okay, I got to turn to Dr. Hutchinson. I'm going to turn over to...
Certainly want to thank our panel members for challenging us today, challenging us to seek and achieve supreme clarity, critical thinking, and challenging us with big understanding. So thanks very much. So Dr. Zenzen is already a member in good standing of the Mad Scientists. Dr. Chalecki got her full gift set yesterday. And today we'll induct Dr. Zalman. So thanks very much, and we'll thank you later, sir. Thanks.